England, March 1943. The rain never seemed to cease. It slicked across the tarmac, dripping from the noses of bombers lined up like slumbering beasts. The crews huddled in ponchos, waiting for instructions. But down at the far end of the field, away from the B-17s and the sleek Spitfires, sat a lonely aircraft that everyone ignored. It wasn't armed. It wasn't armored. It didn't even look like a combat plane. 2 engines, a long nose stuffed with cameras instead of guns, and a strange glint where the gun barrel should have been, painted dull gray. Forgotten. It was the F-5 Lightning, a stripped, seemingly useless variant of the famous P-38. The pilots called it the Ghost, not because it was stealthy, but because no one expected it to return. At 0600 hours, a figure walked toward it through the fog, cigarette in hand, scarf whipping in the wind. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Hawk Jennings. He wasn't famous, wasn't flashy, and most of the base thought he was reckless. But today, he was flying that Ghost straight into German airspace alone. The mechanics didn't even salute. One muttered, "That thing's a coffin with wings." Another smirked. "He'll never make it past Calais." Jennings just grinned, flicked his cigarette into a puddle, and climbed the ladder. The cockpit canopies snapped shut with a metallic click. Inside, the engines hummed to life, a sound softer than thunder, yet sharper than any blade. He pushed the throttle. The Lightning rolled forward, slow and deliberate, as the ground crews stepped aside. Mud sprayed in streaks. The plane lifted from the runway almost lazily and vanished into the fog. 5 hours later, when it returned, they thought it was a hallucination. The engines coughed, smoke trailing from one cylinder. The tires screeched. The F-5 touched down hard, bounced once, and slid to a stop in the rain. Jennings climbed out with frost on his goggles and a roll of film in his hand. "Tell command," he said, breathless. "I found the fuel depots. They developed the photos that afternoon. Perfect clarity. Oil drums, train lines, even the shadows of flak towers. Within a week, Allied bombers struck those targets and crippled Germany's supply chain. The next morning, when Jennings walked back to the same lonely plane, no one laughed. They just watched in silence as he climbed aboard again. The F-5 Lightning had gone from useless to indispensable overnight, because sometimes the plane nobody wanted becomes the one the war cannot win without. Before 1943, every air doctrine, every manual, every mission briefing said the same thing. Speed wins wars. The faster you fly, the longer you survive. The deadliest planes strike first, hit hardest, and outrun everything behind them. But there was a flaw in that belief. Speed couldn't see. Speed couldn't know. The P-38 Lightning had been born for combat. Twin engines, twin tails, a predator in aluminum. But when the F-5 variant arrived, stripped of all guns, fitted with cameras instead, the fighter community treated it like a betrayal. A warplane without weapons. They called it a flying mistake. Even the mechanics complained. "We're sending photographers into a gunfight," one said. "They won't even have time to click the shutter." But intelligence officers understood something the pilots didn't. By 1943, half of all Allied bombing runs were missing their targets. Cities leveled, factories untouched, rail lines still operational. Bombing without precision wasn't strategy. It was chaos. The F-5 was designed to change that. It didn't have to fight. It just had to see. At 30,000 feet, the cameras clicked once every 4 seconds. Each click captured miles of terrain, bridges, and rail junctions. Jennings used to joke, "Every photo I take kills fewer men tomorrow." Still, to the fighter squadrons, it seemed insane. The Luftwaffe skies were full of Bf-109s and F-190s, predators built for speed and destruction. Sending a defenseless F-5 through, that was like throwing a deer into a shark tank. And yet something remarkable happened. The F-5 began to survive. Jennings learned to play with physics. By climbing above the German radar grid, then cutting the throttle mid-flight, the Lightning would slip along the edge of the radar horizon, invisible for 12 minutes at a time. No guns, no escorts, just mathematics and nerve. Those invisible flights produced miracles. Commanders could now observe flak positions, ammo trains, and aircraft dispersal fields weeks ahead of raids. Missions that used to cost 50 bombers now cost 5. Every one of those bombers owed its life to the plane no one wanted. By summer, a quiet rumor spread across the 8th Air Force. If Jennings's ghosts are overhead, we'll make it home. For the first time, pilots started requesting F-5 support, not fighter cover. The myth of speed had begun to die. The new power in the skies wasn't velocity, it was vision. The old generals wanted faster planes. The smart ones wanted clearer pictures. And in that shift, man, from muscle to mind, modern air warfare was born. The F-5 Lightning didn't start as a warplane. It wasn't even meant to exist. Back in 1938, before the war, the Lockheed design team experimented with a twin-engine aircraft for long-range civilian mapping and mail routes. They called it the Model 322. It was over-engineered, costly, and too delicate for airlines. Nobody wanted it. The Army Air Corps politely rejected it. Too complex for combat, too fragile for service. But when the war erupted and the U.S. suddenly found itself blind over Europe, the brass remembered that odd twin-tailed design. High altitude, long range, stable at speed. Maybe, just maybe, it could carry cameras instead of guns. Lockheed engineers gutted it. They removed the armament, ripped out the armor, polished the fuselage to reduce drag, and installed the most advanced optical system in the world. 4 Fairchild K-17 cameras, each capable of taking 300 photographs per hour. It was renamed the F-5 Lightning, a reconnaissance variant of the P-38. Yet, in the air, few took it seriously. One general called it a luxury experiment. Another said, "You can't photograph a war from 30,000 feet." And yet, in hangars from England to North Africa, a handful of officers began to test it. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Hawk Jennings was one of them, a former crop duster turned combat pilot, who understood machines the way ranchers understand horses, by instinct. When he first saw the prototype, he circled it, running his hand along the fuselage. "She doesn't need to fight," he said. "She just needs to keep her eyes open." His commanding officer frowned. "Eyes don't win wars, Jennings. Guns do." Jennings grinned. "Only if you know what to shoot at, sir." By early 1943, the first squadron of F-5s deployed to England. They were given no escorts, no backup, and barely any recognition. But within weeks, their photos began to change how the Allied command planned the air war. One of Jennings' missions revealed a hidden oil refinery near Hamburg, invisible to bombers, missile spies. The strike that followed crippled half of Germany's aviation fuel production for a month. The same general who once called the F-5 a luxury experiment wrote a new memo 2 weeks later. Effective immediately, Vice, all strategic operations require pre-strike photography. The useless plane had just become indispensable. Ironically, the F-5's greatest weakness, its lack of guns, became its greatest strength. It flew lighter, faster, and higher than any bomber escort. The Luftwaffe often didn't even bother chasing it, assuming no one would be foolish enough to fly unarmed that high. But the truth was, those who flew it weren't fools. They were pioneers. The war hadn't just made warriors. It was beginning to make scientists of them. By mid-1943, the air war over Europe had turned into a grim equation. Every week, more bombers went up, and more never came back. The cause wasn't courage. It was ignorance. For every 1,000 Allied aircraft sent into Germany, hundreds vanished without explanation. Bombing maps were outdated. Weather reports were guesswork. Flak concentrations shifted daily. And yet, mission after mission, commanders planned strikes using best estimates, educated guesses written in pencil. The math was brutal. In 1943 alone, 18% of reconnaissance crews never returned. Over 70% of pre-war mapping photos were obsolete, and half of all early bombing missions missed their intended targets entirely. The skies weren't just dangerous, they were blind. Enter the useless F-5 Lightning. Its unarmed design let it climb beyond 30,000 feet, cruising at 49 m, faster than most bombers, nearly untouchable by flak, and invisible to many early radar systems. But the real weapon was its film. Each camera carried enough exposure to map an entire city in one sort. At that altitude, one roll of film covered 200 square miles. And when those photos returned, they transformed chaos into clarity. Intelligence analysts could now plot flak zones, measure railway traffic, and even calculate factory output based on shadows cast by smokestacks. The war became measurable, predictable, targetable. In the new math of warfare, every hour an F-5 spent in the sky saved days of wasted bombing runs and hundreds of lives. Jennings, the stubborn Texan who flew the Ghost, kept a small notebook in his flight jacket. Inside it, he'd scribble after each mission. 1 hour up, 100 hours saved, 1 camera, 10,000 lives. It wasn't bravado. It was arithmetic. When High Command finally reviewed the statistics, they were stunned. Units supported by F-5 reconnaissance flights showed 40% lower loss rates. Mission accuracy jumped by 60%. And even morale improved because aircrews finally knew where they were going and why. Still, bureaucrats resisted. They couldn't understand how an unarmed plane was changing the tide of war. One colonel famously asked, "How can a plane that never fires a bullet be considered a weapon?" Jennings sent him a photo, a perfect overhead shot of a Luftwaffe depot moments before it was bombed to ash with a note. "Because, sir, it fires the truth." The F-5's data became the silent backbone of Allied victory. Every raid over Therarer, every strike on Berlin, every step toward Normandy began with its photographs. And though its pilots never carried machine guns, the Germans began to fear it more than any fighter. They called it Der Unsichtbare, the invisible death. What started as misuse became mastery. What began as lust became wisdom. The math of destruction had found its missing variable. Information. June 11th, 1943. Dawn broke pale over the English coast, and the clouds hung low like gray armor plates. At Station 140, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Hawk Jennings sat alone in the briefing hut, rolling a coin between his fingers. His mission orders lay open on the table, a single page stamped voluntary. Target: the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heart, the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. No escort, no weapons, just a camera. The intelligence division had requested new photos after a string of failed bombing runs. The brass refused to risk fighters. Too dangerous, too costly. Jennings volunteered before they could finish saying suicide. At 05:115 hours, his F-5 Lightning at tail code 87J lifted off the tarmac. Fog swallowed the runway. The only sound was the twin Allison engines rising into the sky. It climbed higher and higher. 25,000, 27,000, 31,000, odd faux. Ice began to bloom along the cockpit frame. The oxygen mask hissed with every breath. Below him, Europe unfolded in silver patches, rivers like veins, smoke curling from distant factories. By the time he crossed the Rhine, German radar picked him up. Flak guns opened up along the horizon, black bursts blooming like poisonous flowers. Jennings didn't flinch. He trimmed the throttle, leveled the wings, and switched the camera on. Click, click, click. Every 4 seconds, the shutters fired, snapping 1,000 fragments of the German war machine. Then, suddenly, 2 black dots appeared below him. Fighters FW-1190s climbing fast. Jennings glanced at his altimeter, 33,000 Avertwalers. He had one advantage: altitude. He cut the throttle, diving into a shallow arc. The fighters overshot, their propellers screaming in frustration. Jennings stayed cold, steady, invisible in their blind spot. He crossed the Ruhr at 34,000 Ft, faster than any German could reach, and photographed 12 targets in a single pass: factories, rail yards, storage depots. Then he turned for home. The fuel gauge dipped near empty. He glided over the channel, engines sputtering, frost creeping up his gloves. The runway at station 140 came into view like a promise. When the wheels touched down, he had less than 5 gallons left. Jennings staggered from the cockpit, half frozen, and handed the canister to the intelligence officer. "Get that film developed," he said. "You'll want to sit down." When the prints emerged hours later, the analysts fell silent. The images were crystal clear, sharper than anything they'd ever seen. They showed new refinery lines, hidden fuel trains, and a web of pipelines no one even knew existed. Within a week, those coordinates guided the largest precision strike of the war to that point. The refinery was obliterated, and Luftwaffe fuel production in the region dropped by 43% in a single month. Jennings never bragged, but when his commanding officer pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to his chest, he finally cracked a smile. "Sir," he said, "guess that useless plane's got a use after all." From that day on, the F-5 Lightning stopped being the joke of the airfield. It became the Air Force's secret weapon, and Jennings, the man who had proved that courage could be measured not in bullets, but in pictures. After Jennings' flight, everything changed, not just for him, but for how the Allies fought the air war. The bomber general stopped gambling with hunches and started listening to film. For the first time, maps weren't drawn from guesswork or hearsay. They were drawn from truth frozen in silver nitrate. Every F-5 photo mission became a domino in the chain of destruction. A single 15-minute flight produced hundreds of frames. Analysts pinned them to boards, aligning them like puzzle pieces. They measured smoke shadows to find engine plants, counted rail cars to estimate fuel reserves. Even the length of cranes at shipyards told them which ships were under repair and which were ready to sail. In a matter of months, Allied air intelligence transformed from chaos into science. The math told the story. Average accuracy of strategic bombing improved by 60%. Bomber losses on photo-supported missions dropped by 42%. Average mission duration fell by 30%. For every 1 hour an F-5 spent in the sky, Allied planners saved 500 hours of bombing flight time. The effect rippled across Europe. Bomb groups began refusing to fly without Jennings' ghosts scouting ahead. One major quipped, "We don't move until the camera clicks." Meanwhile, German command grew paranoid. They increased camouflage operations, built fake airfields, even painted decoy tanks on plywood. But the Americans adapted faster. They switched to infrared film. At night, the fake shadows gave them away. Jennings' squadron became a phenomenon. They flew fewer missions than any bomber unit, but delivered more usable intelligence than all of them combined, and all without firing a single round. The irony wasn't lost on Jennings. One evening, watching bombers thunder into the sunset, he said to his crew chief, "We used to chase glory. Now we chase information, and that's how you win." His useless plane had quietly reshaped the war's logic. Not kill the enemy, but understand the enemy. Not firepower, but clarity. By early 1944, the shift was complete. Aerial reconnaissance wasn't a support tool. It was the spine of Allied operations. Every air raid, every invasion, every paratrooper drop began with an F-5 Lightning's film. Historians would later call it the birth of the invisible battlefield, where decisions were made not by who shot first, but by who knew first. Jennings put it more simply. The best way to survive a war is to see it before it sees you. And from that point on, the Allies did. Spring 1944, southern England was no longer farmland. It was a launch pad. Airfields stretched to the horizon, packed with C-47s, B-26s, and the bombers that would pave the way for the invasion of France. The Allies were preparing for the most ambitious amphibious assault in history. But to pull it off, they needed to know everything. Every trench, every gun, every beach obstacle. And once again, it was the useless F-5 that delivered. Jennings' squadron, the 12th Photo Recon Group, received a sealed order. Map the French coast every inch from Cherbourg to Caen. It sounded impossible. The Germans had turned the coastline into a fortress, the Atlantic Wall with radar, flak, and fighters on constant patrol. But Jennings just smirked. "We'll go higher," he said. Over the next 6 weeks, his F-5s flew one out 200 missions across occupied France. No guns, no escorts, only cameras. They mapped 400 meters of coastline, sometimes photographing the same sector twice a day to track enemy movements. The photos revealed minefields disguised under sand, fake bunkers painted on dunes, and, most critically, the weak spots. Analysts in London used Jennings' film to build a 3D model of Normandy from cardboard and plaster, a detailed replica of every road, bridge, and bunker. Eisenhower himself studied it before approving the invasion plan. One night, Jennings walked into the intelligence tent and found 2 generals bent over his latest photos. One pointed at a small bridge near St. Laurent and said, "That one. We'll send the paratroopers here." Jennings realized for the first time what his flying mistake had truly accomplished. On June 6, 1944, when the invasion began, the F-5s weren't carrying bombs. They were carrying eyes. Carrying bombs. They were carrying eyes. Jennings led a dawn flight hours before hour, photographing the beaches under artillery fire. His last radio transmission that morning: "Tides perfect, obstacles visible. Tell the boys they've got a clear shot." Those images arrived just as the first waves hit Omaha. Thanks to his recon, engineers avoided hidden minefields, and pilots adjusted bombing runs with near-perfect accuracy. After D-Day, General Spot sent a note to Jennings' unit. "Your photos guided the eyes of every man who-landed today. History will call it the work of soldiers. We know it was the work of your lenses." The F-5s flew hundreds more missions that month, charting German reinforcements, tracking tank divisions, and exposing retreat routes. Every success, every breakthrough carried a fingerprint from Jennings' useless aircraft. By July, the brass officially changed its designation in the registry. The F-5 was no longer listed as reconnaissance support. It was now marked Strategic Asset Priority 1. The plane the Air Corps once mocked had become the tool that made D-Day possible. Jennings later wrote in his diary, "We didn't fire a single shot, but that day our cameras killed tyranny." By late 1944, the F-5 Lightning had gone from a footnote to the most hunted aircraft in the European sky. The Luftwaffe finally realized the truth. These unarmed planes weren't spectators. They were the eyes that guided every bomb, every ambush, every surprise. And without them, the Allied war machine would go blind. Jennings' squadron had earned a nickname among German pilots: the Ghosts. The F-5s flew too high, too fast, and too smart to catch. But one flight would prove how much damage a single photograph could do. December 15, 1944, one day before the Battle of the Bulge, Jennings was ordered to photograph the Ardennes Forest, a quiet sector supposedly. The brass thought German forces were retreating. Jennings wasn't so sure. "Forests don't breathe," he said. "But that one looks alive." He took off before dawn, his oxygen tank hissing as frost crept along the canopy. At 31,000 FT, he saw it, a shimmer of movement below. Then another. He banked hard, switching cameras, shooting wide angles of what looked like empty fields. But when the photos developed, the truth hit like artillery fire. Under those trees were thousands of vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, all camouflaged under netting and snow. The Luftwaffe had been hiding an army in plain sight. Jennings' film caught it red-handed. That one photo changed everything. Eisenhower's staff immediately ordered reinforcements toward the Ardennes. When the German offensive launched the next morning, the Allies weren't blind. They were ready. The Luftwaffe tried to strike back, sending Mi-262s and FW-90 to hunt the ghost planes. One F-5 was caught near Cologne. The German pilot opened fire, shredding its left engine. The lightning should have gone down, but the pilot stayed steady, camera still rolling. The wrecked plane limped home on one engine, camera film intact. The photos it carried revealed the last operational fuel depot of the Luftwaffe. Within days, Allied bombers hit them all. German sorties dropped by 70% in just 2 weeks. When captured engineers later examined the wrecked F-5s, they were baffled. No armor, no guns, one said. But every one of our losses began with this. For Jennings, it was bittersweet. His useless plane had crippled the Luftwaffe. But half his squadron never made it home. They had no weapons, no way to fight back. They won their war with film canisters instead of bullets. After the Ardennes, the photo units were awarded a Presidential Unit Citation, but quietly off the record. Jennings was there, standing beside his battered F-5, its nose still starry with frost. When asked how he felt about being called a ghost, he simply smiled. "If we were ghosts," he said, "then every picture we took was proof we were still alive." Those ghosts didn't just survive. They turned vision into victory. By spring 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. Not from firepower alone, but from precision. The German war machine wasn't just bombed, it was dissected. Every rail hub, every refinery, every bridge was hit with mathematical accuracy. And every strike began the same way. With the shutter of an F-5 camera, Jennings' photos had become doctrine across every airfield from England to Italy. Reconnaissance was now the first mission of the day and the last mission of the night. Commanders no longer asked if they had pictures. They asked when. And when Berlin finally fell, they found something remarkable in the ruins of the Luftwaffe's own archives. Stacks of captured American film, neatly labeled and studied by German intelligence. The Nemi had been learning from the F-5's work, trying to copy it. The irony was painful and poetic. The same useless plane the U.S. by once refused to arm had become the blueprint of total air dominance. So effective, the Germans tried to imitate its methods. Jennings didn't make the victory parade. He stayed behind to help pack up the reconnaissance equipment. When one officer asked why, he shrugged. "Because the next war is already starting," he said. And he was right. Within months, U.S. engineers took what the F-5 taught them: high-altitude optics, lightweight design, rapid image relay, and turned it into the foundation for the Cold War's spy planes. The U-2, the SR-71 Blackbird, even the reconnaissance satellites that would orbit the Earth decades later, all traced their lineage back to the flying fortress of cameras, and the mechanics and pilots who refused to be ordinary. Jennings' F-5 was retired, its film bays stripped and sent to museums. The rest were scrapped, replaced by jets. But in one photo taken from Jennings' last flight, you can still see the message scrolled under the canopy and chalk. "Still flying useless. It washes joke but also his legacy," he later said. "They thought we were running away from the fight. We were running toward the truth. That truth ended the Luftwaffe's dream, saved thousands of lives, and redefined warfare forever. The world had built bombers to destroy. Jennings created a way to see. In the quiet after the war, as cities were rebuilt and factories hummed once more, the men of the photo squadrons faded into history. Unarmed, uncelebrated, but undefeated. Because while others fought for fame, they fought for clarity. And clarity, as it turned out, was the ultimate weapon. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the world cheered for the bomber crews, the aces, the generals. But in a quiet hangar in southern England, a handful of men packed up their cameras, their negatives, and their silence. No medals, no parades, just boxes marked classified. Among them was Captain Ray Jennings. His F-5 Lightning, serial 42-68272, sat parked near the fence, the same aircraft that had outflown flak, frost, and every German trap for nearly 3 years. Its silver skin was dulled, its lenses still smudged with desert dust. A young airman walked by and asked, "Sir, what's going to happen to her?" Jennings looked at the plane, the one they had once called useless, and replied, "She's done her fighting. Time she got some rest." Within a week, it was dismantled. Her cameras shipped to a warehouse in Maryland. Her airframe melted down for aluminum. But the film she captured, 1.4 million images across 2 continents, would endure. Her photographs mapped Europe's destruction and recovery. They guided post-war relief, rebuilt rail lines, and even revealed hidden POW camps. The F-5 had stopped a war and then helped heal it. Years later, when the Air Force declassified the reconnaissance archives, historians discovered something remarkable. Every major Allied victory from 1943 onward had relied on F-5 footage. Monte Cassino, D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, Berlin. Jennings's ghost plane wasn't just a camera with wings. It was proof that in the age of total war, knowledge was the new ammunition. He returned to Kansas after the war, took a job as a crop duster, and rarely spoke of what he had done. But every now and then, he'd point to the sky when a jet passed overhead and say, "That one's got our eyes in it." In the final photograph of him, taken in 1963, he's standing beside an old propeller turned into a weather vane. On the blade, hand engraved, are 4 words: "Still flying useless." RJ. It's the story of a man who turned nothing into everything, and of a plane that defeated an empire not with fire, but with vision. The B-17s brought thunder, the P-51s brought speed, but the F-5 Lightning, the once useless one, brought truth, and that, more than any bullet or bomb, was what ended the war. Bullet or bomb was what ended the war.